I come here feeling really optimistic about 2020. I feel very optimistic about the Croatian presidency. And I'm also going to talk about something else that also makes me very optimistic, which is data protection by design and defaults. I'm not going to make this into a very legal presentation or technical, but I think it's just useful to start off with looking at what does the GDPR say that organizations should comply with. So first of all, it says that they should comply with the law. Yeah, that seems kind of logical. But what it says is that the legislator is really trusting businesses and public sector entities to take this responsibility seriously. And they need to demonstrate how to do that. And that's obviously useful for us as a data protection authority because we can ask to see that documentation. But it's also a tool that will help businesses in complying with the law, because then they can see and assess what do we have, what do we need to improve. I'm not going to spend 20 minutes talking about documentation, so don't worry about that. Also, the GDPR says that you need to have in place measures, both technical and organizational, in order to achieve this. And what this means, in essence, is that you need to have a very systematic approach to the GDPR. Because otherwise, it will simply not be possible for you to comply with the GDPR. The GDPR is, as we know, complicated. Having these measures in place will make it a lot easier for organizations. And what is really good about the GDPR is that it encourages a risk-based approach, meaning that the measures you put in place can be proportional to the data processing activities and the risk for individuals out there. Finally, the GDPR says that everyone should have data protection by design and default, which sounds very nice, but it's sometimes a bit tricky to understand what that means in practice, so we're going to have a look at what that means and how organizations can work with that. But key here is the data protection principles. They are the thing that we want to implement within our organization. Now, sometimes, speaking to people, I sometimes get the reaction that they think that the GDPR is just a paper tiger, right? So, paper tiger could be many things, but it seems that some people perceive it as this instrument that forces you to have a lot of documentation in place. As long as you have documentation, and everything is fine. I'm just going to make a few examples. The first one is a case that we handled in Norway many years ago. It was about a university, and they had a training lab for athletes. So the athletes, professional athletes, on the national level, could go there and get help with their technique. So that sounds like a very good thing to do, right? And this university, they had all the documentation in place. They had all the procedures, all the routines. It was really good, but they didn't follow it in practice. So they had all this paperwork and everyone was ignoring it. And then one day they decided that in our lab, we want to install a camera, because then the camera can monitor the athletes as they are doing their sports, and then afterwards we can analyze it and give feedback. Should be fine. What's the worst thing that can happen? Well, actually, because they didn't follow their procedures, they didn't really apply security mechanisms, which means that that camera was unsafe and it was possible to access it from the internet. And someone did that. So they hacked into the camera, they took control of the camera, and they used it to kind of zoom in on the athlete's body. Now, some of these athletes were not wearing shirts, right? So these images were actually posted online, and they were kind of posted in a sexualized context. And to make matters even worse, not all of the athletes were actually adults. Some of them were under the age of 18. So this was extremely serious. And obviously, when you go to a training lab at a university, you expect to be safe. And as a parent, you expect your children to be safe when you go there. and because they did not apply their documentation and procedures and routines, the children were not safe. Another example is an example of what happens when data protection is not the default setting. And this is a very recent case in Norway. So we had an app that schools would use to communicate with the parents of the students. And they made sure that this app was only available to parents who actually had parental responsibility. Because some parents don't have that, maybe because they were an abusive parent or something like that. In some cases, the family had to move away from one of the parents because they were abusive, right? But in that app, they made sure that the information was only available to the parent with parental responsibility, and this was to ensure the safety of the children. And then they upgraded their system. And as it turns out, in this system, the default setting is everyone has access. If you're a registered parent, then you have access, essentially. And then you have to manually remove access for those parents who should not have access. So there were actually children living on a confidential address because it would be dangerous for them to be in contact with one of the parents, who suddenly now found that their address was available to that parent. So obviously that was very, very serious. And the point I want to make here is that all of these procedures, they're there for a reason, a very good reason. And having those procedures in place will effectively help you as an organization to comply with the GDPR and avoid these kinds of incidents. And this is something we think about ourselves because as a data protection authority, we also process a lot of personal data. So this is also a concern for us, right? I think it's important to just think about why do you need to have procedures and why do you need to have data protection by design default? Because it helps us to kind of aim our efforts. We know what we want to do, but it's also more motivating, isn't it? Because you know the things you're doing, you're actually doing it for something good. So first of all, I would say that it is a lot cheaper to prevent than to repair. So a lot of organizations, both in the public and private sector, they have a lot of IT systems. Often they're quite old. And then they realize, okay, this system is not really compliant with the GDPR. I have an issue. It doesn't allow me to process access requests. It's unsafe. I need to change it. So if you try to do that with an old system, a legacy system, you will find that that's actually really expensive because the system is already there and it's difficult to kind of try and change it. It will take a long time and it may not even be successful. But if you have built data protection principles within the system from the beginning, you will find that you're actually saving resources because by doing it from the beginning, the job is already done. And the same goes for procedures, organizational measures. So, because often procedures will build on procedures that build on procedures, and if the original procedure is good, then you're fine. Also, having data protection mechanisms in place will make you prepared whenever action is required. So the minute you have a data breach, you know what to do, right? So you don't need to call everyone in legal and make them stop everything they're doing, call all your technical experts and use a lot of resources to figure out what you do about this data breach. You already have a routine in place, you know what to do. Also, having data protection by design default will give you a higher level of protection, because then you're not just running around trying to put out fires. We know from the news that putting out fires is very difficult. It's much better to prevent those fires from happening to begin with, because with every fire there is damage. If you leave personal data, the damage is already done. And yeah, you can try and fix it so that it doesn't happen again, but it's already happened, so it's a bit too late. Also, planning ahead allows you to maintain functionality in your system. So suddenly you find out that, okay, what we're doing here with this system, it's not compliant. We need to stop, we need to shut that system down. So even though that system is doing something really good and important that people like, and that has a very important functionality in society, we need to stop it until we have rectified this error, until we have improved information security. But if you started with building information security within the system, you don't have to do that. So therefore, again, it's better to plan ahead. Also, and this is very, very important, I think, a lot of users, when you speak to them, they say that, you know, I'm happy with being on social media, I'm happy with using this app, I'm happy to provide my data to my local authority because I can trust them. I trust that they handle my personal data in a good way. And when people trust us, we actually get more data. People are not scared to file a complaint with the Data Protection Authority because they know that we will actually protect their personal data. But if they realise that, oh no, they're not protecting my data, then that trust is going to disappear. And that's really, really bad, I think. And then we're not getting the data that we as a society need to be using. Finally, and this has already been mentioned several times today, data protection by design default is a competitive advantage, because let's say that you are an organisation and you need a new IT system. Which one are you going to choose? Are you going to choose the one without any data protection mechanisms, or are you going to choose the one that was developed using data protection by design default? Probably you're going to choose the latter, because it gives you security and it enables you to comply with your own obligations, right? And the same goes for individual users. Consumers will choose, most likely, if they actually get a choice, the service that protects them in the best way. So, data protection by design can be a bit critical. It's about incorporating all of these data protection mechanisms within both your IT systems and your processes and your routines and your organization at any stage. So you need to do it from the beginning, as we just discussed, but you also need to do it along the way, because the world is constantly evolving. Maybe you find out that you want to use data in a new way or something like that. And so this is an evolving process, never-ending process. Again, it's risk-based, but you need to make sure that the measures you put in place are effective. But, I mean, what should you do? How should you incorporate fairness into your procedures? Is it sufficient just to write, hi everyone, please remember to process personal data in a fair manner? That's not going to cut it, is it? So the European Data Protection Board has adopted guidelines about this, and in those guidelines, if you look at them, you will see that they're kind of trying to be more specific about what these principles mean in practice. So for instance, for fairness, it's very important that the data subject gets autonomy, and that could be where consent is the legal basis, that you actually collect consent in a valid way. So you need to have that in your system, in your app, on your web page. When you're collecting that consent, then your IT system actually supports doing so in a valid way, right? Non-discrimination, I think, is very important, especially in the age of artificial intelligence, because we don't always understand what the algorithms are doing or why they have reached a specific result. So yes, you need to make sure that your AI processing system actually has safeguards in place that will allow you to understand how that individual decision was reached, at least to some extent. You're not going to understand all of it, but maybe to some extent it can give you some meaningful information. But actually here, you could also have organizational measures. You could have testing, and that testing may allow you to discover whether there is bias in the algorithm. For instance, if it favors men over women, that could be a form of bias that could be discovered through testing. You could also have an external ethics board that could help you and assess how your algorithm is doing. And I mean, this goes for all of the principles, right? So for instance, for transparency, you need to really think about, okay, I want my information to be clear. That's a requirement pursuant to the GDPR. How do I ensure that all the people writing our data protection policy, they need to be really skilled and trained in how to write it. I could also have technical measures in place, maybe like a dictionary on my web page. We could do user testing to see